If you stopped at the end of tutorial 5.2, I want you to go ahead and open Excel 2010. Maximize the Excel window and find your file. In my case, I'm going to my OneDrive. And there it is, 5.2. Immediately do a file save as and change the 5.2 to 5.3. In 5.1, we learned how to convert a range of cells into a table and how to do a little bit of sorting within the table. In 5.2, we did a little bit more sorting within the table. We added some items and we also did some filtering with the table itself. We also learned how to convert back to a range from a table, and we learned to put in subtotals. And through a little bit of muddling through and a few of the mistakes that we made, we learned some of the things that we needed to do. So for example, before we convert back from a table to a range, we really should be in cell A1. Now I haven't read anywhere where that's the case, but for whatever reason that seems to have worked and it fixed the problem. So when we had the subtotals, we also had our sorting areas on the left hand side. So when we clicked on the buttons, we were able to see the grand total, the subtotals, and then everything in between. At this point with your 5.2 data sheet, or the sheet that we have for 5.2, we are going to start working with a pivot table. And a pivot table really is a table that allows us to gather information in form of summaries, whether it's sum of numeric values or counts, averages, minimum, maximum numbers. For the most part, it is a function to summarize a lot of information that's gathered within a very detailed worksheet. If your worksheet currently is not a table, and the way you can tell is just click anywhere, and if you don't see the table tools come up, then that means you don't have your worksheet set up as a table. So click anywhere within the first two rows, first two columns, go to the Insert tab, go to the Table button, and like before, it's going to show us the range of cells that it considers to be part or should be part of a table, and click OK, and now we have our table. To insert a pivot table, since we're going to insert something, we're going to the Insert tab, and instead of clicking on the table, by the way, it's already a table, that's why it's grayed out, we're going to click on the button to the left of table in the tables area. Remember, in the Insert tab to the left, we're going to click on Pivot Table, and it's going to ask us which table or range it's going to take the information from in order to create a pivot table. Now I'm actually missing a step, so bear with me just for a second here. I'm going to go to my table design, and our table was supposed to be named Art Objects Table. Okay, now we're ready. Let's go ahead and insert a pivot table. We're going to select the table Art Objects, and we want to put that in a new worksheet. So we're going to click OK. And this isn't like all the other things that we insert. For the most part, all the other objects that we've inserted have made perfect sense. This gives us a starting point in order to decide what it is we want in our in our pivot table. If you look on the right, this is our field list in order to build our pivot table. In the top, we have all of the fields that are in our table. So we have the art ID, the artist, the title, date acquired. All of the column headings along the top of our table are listed as fields to add to our pivot table, to our report. At the bottom, we have our report filter, but we'll talk about that one in a little bit. But if you look to the right, we have column labels. So we can choose pretty much any of these fields on top and add them as either a column label or a row label. Remember, the column labels are headers along the top of your sheet, and row labels are along the left of your sheet. Those are like the headings along the left of your sheet. And of course, the values are the numeric values that are going to be used in order to perform certain calculations like sum, count, etc., etc. So the first thing that we're going to do, we're going to add the location field to our pivot table. By default, it's going to put the location as a row label. Notice that we now have our row label, the Courtyard East Pavilion. Remember, these are all the locations that were inside of our table, and we're going to also click on the appraised value now. So as we click on the appraised value, Excel takes it upon itself to add the values alongside the row labels. So we have a grand total, and we have the totals that are summed up as subtotals, if you will, for each of the locations within our sheet. So if we were to look at the table that we created when we had the subtotals, or actually when we converted from a table to a range of cells, and we had the subtotals, we would see that these subtotals would line up. Let's go ahead and rename our sheet 1, the sheet that we're working on. We're going to double click and rename this appraised value summary. We're going to add the category and the condition fields to our pivot table. One thing to remember in case you didn't get the additional fields going into your table, if the field list doesn't show up, that simply means that your pivot table isn't active on your sheet. So to bring your tools back, you simply click anywhere within the table, within the pivot table, and your tools will come back. So let's go ahead and click on category, and we're going to bring back condition. And as you can see, by default, the fields are being set up as row labels. So we've got our courtyard, and then in the like a subcategory, we have the installation and the conditions that they're in, all alongside. So we basically just have two columns at this point. We're going to change our table style to pivot style dark 4. So in our design tab, make sure you're in the design tab within the pivot tools. We're going to click on the more button, and because it's a dark style, we're going to go all the way to the bottom. We have light, we have medium, and as we scroll down, we will have the darks. So we want the dark style 4. And now we're going to format the appraised value numbers in the pivot table. So we're going to format the appraised value numbers here. So we're going to click in any cell in the sum of appraised value column. we're going to click the Pivot Tools option, and we're going to go to the Field Settings button in our active field group. So Pivot Tools, we're going to go to our Options tab, and we're going to click the Field Settings. So we're going to our active field area, click on Field Settings, and we get our dialog box. We're going to go to our Show Values As, and the custom name of our field settings, of these settings that we're going to set up, I guess we're just going to leave them the same. We're going to leave it as sum of appraised value. In our summarized value by, we're going to keep it as sum. We're going to go to our number format, and we're going to choose for our numbers to be shown as currency. We'll take the default values, click OK, and instead of sum of appraised value, let's go ahead and change that to total appraised value. And let's click OK. And notice that our numbers now have been formatted to show currency with 2 decimal places. As we look at our layout, we can see that it is helpful. It is giving us some information. It's got like an outline form. It's giving us some subtotals, but everything seems to be condensed into 2 columns. Let's drag the condition field button. So we've got our field button down at the bottom, and it's in the row labels. Let's click and drag it to the column labels. Now we have a little bit more of a complete picture. So we've got our courtyard, we have our East Pavilions, all of our locations, the type of art that we have, and the conditions that they're in. It's a little bit easier to see what we have. Now we're going to click on our Pivot Table Design Tools, and we're going to click on the Report Layout and show this in outline form. So let's look at the difference. By default, it puts it in compact form. So right now it's going to go from compact to outline. As an outline form, notice that the structure of our pivot table, it looks like an outline. So we've got our heading, we have our subheading, but it's not compact. It's not tucked in under the different headings. So this would work well if we wanted in this kind of view. Let's change it back to the way it was. It looks a little bit nicer when it's kind of condensed, more compact. So compact form, and it gives us our subheadings a little bit closer to where the headings are. We're going to add a filter, a report filter, to our field list. We're going to drag the location button from the row label text to the report filter box. Notice that the locations disappeared from our table, but they're still up here. They're still up here. So let's just keep working on this right now. we're going to go ahead and filter. So we're going to click on our location, the little drop down button that shows up. Right now everything is showing, all the subtotals are there. But we're going to filter by East Pavilion. So we're going to click on East Pavilion. Click OK. So the only totals that show up now are going to be everything that's in the East Pavilion. So all the paintings, sculptures, and textiles in the East Pavilion in all the conditions that they're in. We're going to take our location and our location button from our report filter, and we're going to position it right above the category field. So we're going to bring it back, but now you have to be careful here. If we just bring it back to the box itself, there's a problem of it showing up in the order as you drag it down. So we want the location button to actually show up above the category button. So let's click and drag it until it shows up. You see how that line, it's a little hard to see, but once you see a line kind of flip to above the category, then you let it go. So now we have our pivot table the way we had it earlier. Notice that we have filter arrows in the row labels and also in the column labels. Let's go ahead and click on the column labels. So remember, these are the column labels up here, right? So we have the row labels, excellent, good, fair, poor, grand total, and these are our row labels. So in our column labels, we're going to click on the box for poor so we can deselect the objects in poor condition. Once we click OK, it's going to remove that one column of the art objects that are in poor condition. We can also start collapsing our subtotals. So if we only want to see the totals that are within the courtyard, East Pavilion, not caring that we want to see the types of art objects they are, we can collapse our headings, our row headings, so that only the locations show up. Now let's say we wanted to go ahead and expand them all in one shot. We can go to our pivot table tools, into options, and we can go to our active field area and we can expand all of the fields. So by clicking expand entire field, that's going to go ahead and expand everything. Or by the same token, if you wanted to collapse everything, we could just click on the collapse entire field area. So for now, let's go ahead and expand everything, and let's do a little bit of sorting now. We're going to click on cell E5. So E5 is going to give us a grand total of everything within the courtyard. So that includes all of the installations, paintings, and sculptures. And in the tools option, we're going to sort largest to smallest. So let's go ahead and click on the sort largest to smallest. So the ZA. Notice that it is actually sorting by the subtotal of the locations. So the location that has the highest number is the East Pavilion with 600,000, and then the next one is the Courtyard, 200,000, etc. As we get to the West Pavilion that has the lowest number. We currently only have one value field, which is the total field, right? The appraised value. Let's add another value field to our pivot table. So we're going to click on the title field to give us titles. And we're going to actually drag that to our values area. And we're going to go ahead and put it just to the right of, or I'm sorry, just underneath the total appraised value. Notice that it's looking at this entry as from a value perspective, and the only value it could really have is to count. So it's going to count the number of titles. Since the titles themselves are not a number, it can't add them, subtract them, it can't sum them. But what it can do is it can definitely count how many of those items are there. So as far as titles, we have 15 titles in the East Pavilion, we have 1 in the courtyard, we have 1 in the garden. So you can see how it's taking the titles of all these items and using them to count whatever titles are showing up. Now what we want to do is we want to click on any of the count titles. It can be this one, it can be this one, it doesn't matter. All right. And we're going to change the label because count of title just seems a little bit too long. So we're going to click on the count of title in the active field area, and we're going to change the title here. So we're going to call it count instead of count of title. We're going to hit enter on our keyboard, and notice that the column title in all 3 of the instances changed from count of title to simply count. Now we're going to remove the title field from our pivot table. If for whatever reason your field list is not showing, go to the show area and click on the field list button. That way you can see all of your different fields or field lists. We're going to uncheck the title from the choose fields to report, and notice at this point that the columns disappeared from all of our entries from our pivot table. If we want to remove the field headers and also hide the collapse button. So let's say we don't want the field headers anymore and we want to get rid of these collapsible buttons over here. We simply go to our show area, and if we click once on the plus and minus that's over here, notice that the expansion and collapsing buttons disappear. And if we click on field headers, it's going to remove the field headers. Now it's not going to remove the field headers that we have here. It's going to remove the field headers that the pivot table automatically adds. Earlier we were able to sort or filter our data by using the filter arrows. There's actually an easier way to do that. It's called a slicer, a pivot table slicer. So let's go ahead and put one in. We're going to go to our insert. Make sure that somewhere within that one of the active cells is within your table so that the pivot table tools are showing up. And we're going to go to our pivot tools table and options tab, and we're going to go to our sort and filter area, which is right here, and we're going to insert a slicer. Then click insert slicer. From here we choose the fields that we want to be able to sort by. So what we're going to choose is we're going to choose location, and let's go ahead and click OK. So notice that our slicer now has all the locations in our table. Let's change the column of our width F to 8 characters. So we all kind of agree that the easiest way is to right click, column width, type in 8, click OK, and there is our column width to 8. We can take our location slicer and align it with the top of the pivot table. Within our options of our slicer, we can change the height. Notice how there's a lot of blank space here. So let's just change that to 1.9. And the width, let's change it to 1.3. Now they're giving us the dimensions that they want us to have it by, but let's say we didn't have those dimensions. We could simply go to our sizing handle midway up the right side of our border, and we can go ahead and adjust it ourselves until we see the size that we like. So if we eyeball it, we can see that we're pretty close. So you know, it was 1.9, 1.3, not too far off. So just keep in mind that you're not always going to be told what size of slicer or what size of an item it's going to be. So you should really know how to adjust it on your own. Let's click on the East Pavilion, but not before that. Notice that they don't match. They don't look the same. So let's go ahead and click on our, make sure that it's highlighted, our slicer is highlighted. Click on our slicer styles more button, and we want slicer style dark 3. So this is light, this is dark. Notice there's no medium. So here's our dark 3 style, which is the closest one to our dark 4 that we applied earlier to our pivot table. If we click on the East Pavilion button in our slicer, notice that only the East Pavilion items show up, so the filter works out. If we wanted to add another portion or add another filter, so if we wanted the East Pavilion and also the South Pavilion, we hold down the Control key and click on South Pavilion, and as soon as we let go of the Control key, that's when the rest of the items show up. And if we wanted to add the West Pavilion, hold down the Control key, click on West Pavilion. As you let go of the Control button, the West Pavilion items are going to show up. To remove the filters in our pivot table through the slicer, we simply click on the little filter area with a little red X next to it. We click on that, and that clears all of the filters. So what happens if you make changes to the source of our pivot table? Let's go ahead and go to the Art Collection worksheet, and we're going to find Criddler, Dancing in the Light, which is Art ID 73. Well, there's several ways we could go in here and start surfing and looking for it, or we could simply go to our Find button, and we know that it's Art ID 73. Find Next, and there it is. We can close our search field. So there's Criddler, Dancing in the Night, and the appraised value has actually gone up from 1,000 to 4,000. If we go to our appraised value summary worksheet, we can see that the appraised values have not shown up because the art collection here, it's a sculpture in the East Pavilion. So here's the sculpture in the East Pavilion. All those numbers are still the same. So in order to update our information, we're going to click on any cell within the pivot table. We're going to go to our pivot tables tools and then options, and we're going to refresh our data. So we go down to our data area, click refresh. Now go ahead and keep an eye on this while it's happening. Click refresh, and now the values have updated themselves within the pivot table. Let's hide our field list, and we simply do that by going to our show area. Remember, pivot table tools, options, and deselect the field list. That makes our field list items disappear. And now it's time to create a pivot table based on the date acquired field. So we're going to go to our art collection tab, or our art collection worksheet. Make sure that the table is active, so simply by clicking anywhere, really, we know that our table is active. We're going to go to our insert tab. So remember, we're going to put in a pivot table. So it's insert and then pivot table and pivot table. Our dialog box comes up, our create pivot table dialog box. We're going to select from the table, which is the art objects table, and we're going to place it in a new worksheet. Click OK, and we get the familiar settings. So we have our pivot table field list on this side, and we're going to choose the date acquired field, and of course by default it's going to put it down here in the row label, and we're going to click art ID. So that gives us our second column, and because this is a sum value, date acquired, it's a number. If you remember from a previous lecture, dates are numbers. It's just formatted for our purposes so we can understand what date that we're in. And we see a lot of useless information really because it's not really shortened up just yet. So we're going to keep working on it. We're going to click in any value in the sum of art ID column. Go to our pivot tables option tools, and in the calculations area, we're going to click on summarize values by, and we're going to use count. Remember, sum does us no good at this point because it's adding our art ID numbers, so we're not supposed to be adding those. So we're going to change that to a count function. So it gives us a count of the art ID and the dates that they were acquired. So still a little not as useful information as we would like. So we're going to go to our date column, and it would make more sense if it would show us by year instead of by month and day the way it has it right now. So we're going to go to our group field. So pivot tools, going to go to options, and in our group field we're going to click on the group field button, and we're going to deselect month, and we're going to go straight to years and deselect month. Click OK. So now we have something that's a little bit more useful. By the number of years, or by the year, we have the count of art ID. So these are the number of art items that were given to us in the years that are shown here. Let's rename our worksheet. Instead of sheet 2, let's call it acquired by year. Enter. And now we're going to create a pivot chart. So we're going to click in any item within our pivot table. Go to our pivot tools. We're going to go to options. And in the tools area, we're going to click on pivot chart. We're going to get a clustered column, which is the first one in the columns area. And if you're not sure, you hold the mouse over the icon and it'll tell you what selection that is, what type of chart that is. So we want a clustered column. Highlight that. Click OK. And we have our chart layouts. So we have our pivot chart tools now. So we have pivot table, pivot chart. Make sure you understand the difference between the two. We're going to go to layout, and we don't want the legend because this is really just total. So we're going to go to our legend button, choose none. That way our legend is gone on the side. And in the pivot chart itself, we're going to right click on the chart title. So here's a chart title. We're going to right click on it. And we're going to edit the text and type number acquired by year. Oh, don't hit enter, just click away when it's done. So notice that when we clicked on our title and then edit text, all it really does is it inserts the cursor so we can start editing it. Quite honestly, could we have done that by double clicking inside? Yes. Maybe not double clicking, because double clicking will take us into our format chart area, but we can click and then click again. So click to highlight, click again inside, and that takes us into edit mode as well. Let's highlight our chart still, and we're gonna move it so that the upper left corner is aligned in cell C3. So here's C3. So we're gonna drag and align it in C3. So that way our pivot table and our pivot chart are right next to each other. Now we can also do filtering in our pivot chart. So in our field list, we're going to bring that back up. Notice that it's not showing right now, right? Well, now it is. Once we highlight it, remember when the field list tools don't show, we have to make sure that we're in whatever item so that our tools come back up. We're going to click the date acquired access field. So here's our date acquired, and this is our access field. So we're going to click there. And we have our date acquired filter arrow. And we're going to click on select all to deselect all of the years, because we really only want the following years to show up. We want 2010, 11, 12, and 13 to be highlighted. We click OK. So now we have the number of years, or the years that we wanted the information from. If we wanted to add more years on top of that, we could easily click on our date acquired filter button and add another year. And our little table or our chart would become as effective, or would show as much or as little data as we saw fit. And that's the end of our pivot tables, pivot charts. It's not necessarily difficult to create them. The difficult part is in realizing what it is you want to show. So the easiest way is really to create kind of a map or a drawing of what you want to show. Once you have that, the really nice thing about the pivot table and its tools is if you're not really sure how something looks, so for example, let's go to our total of appraised value. It's actually quite simple to think, well, what would happen if I were to take location and put that as a column label? Okay, that does not seem quite as useful, so let's go ahead and bring that back, and we can play with it. We can go ahead and move things around until we see what format it would be the most useful to us. So that's the end of tutorial 5.3. If you have any questions, make sure you get a hold of me, and we're gonna go ahead and start working on our assignments. By the time you get this video, I'm hoping that the assignment schedule is already on, so go ahead and look to see what assignment is due right after you complete your tutorial 3. We'll see you in class.